Good evening and welcome to the 5th Propaganda Podcast of the 3rd season. The Propaganda Podcast, formerly known as the Moral Economy Podcast, is brought to you by The Moral Economy. The Moral Economy is an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and transdisciplinary group of writers, researchers, artists, and activists. In very real terms, we wish to understand the underpinnings of our economic, political, and moral world, as well as to develop practical models for applying and living those understandings. The Propaganda Podcast is so called because we see propaganda everywhere we look. In the news, on the TV, in our favorite books and films, propaganda permeates the very fabric of our symbolic world. And like the drifter from the classic movie, They Live, all we want to do is make you wear the glasses and see the propaganda that is right before your eyes. The Moral Economy is here to chew bubblegum and kick ass, and we're all out of bubblegum. I'm one of your hosts, Andrew.
I'm another one of your hosts, Chell.
Yeah, I'm also one of those people who eats bubblegum. My name's Awaz.
Thank you, guys. Okay, so we'll get right into the global political situation, GPS, starting with the chemical attack in Syria. So, the New York Times reports that one of the worst chemical bombings in Syria turned a northern rebel-held area into a toxic kill zone on Tuesday, inciting international outrage over the ever-increasing government impunity shown in the country's 6-year war. Quote, dozens of people, including children, died after breathing in poison that possibly contained a nerve agent or other banned chemicals, according to witnesses, doctors, and rescue workers. They said the toxic substance spread after warplanes dropped bombs in the early morning hours. Some of the rescue workers grew ill and collapsed from the proximity to the dead. The attack took place in Idlib, in northern Syria. Most players in the international community are blaming the Russian-backed Assad regime for the attack on Tuesday, but Russia claims that the chemical was released after bombs hit depots where rebels were producing the gas. On the following Wednesday, 5 more airstrikes by the Assad warplanes took place in the area. It is abundantly clear that the release of the chemical on civilians amounts to a war crime. With over 70 people dead, among them 20 children, the World Health Organization is reporting some of the victims had symptoms consistent with exposure to nerve agents. But since Tuesday, the story in international news outlets has largely shifted away from the human devastation in northern Syria and from what we in the international community can do about it, and towards U.S. President Donald Trump's reaction to the attack. This shift in focus accompanies an overall attempt by international leaders to continue playing the blame game. It is important for us to see this, however, as a part of a larger effort by the media to deflect attention away from more important questions. By focusing on reactions and finger-pointing, the international community fails to enter the important and fundamentally democratic process of public discourse. This discourse would include calling for a complete halt of arms sales to the region and highlight the role of the Syrian YPG, People's Protection Units, in creating safe zones for fleeing civilians. In the latest autopsies by the World Health Organization in Adana, Turkey, along with officials from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, confirmed that the chemicals were used in attack, but the Syrian regime still denies playing any role.
Yeah, we have another sad story coming out of St. Petersburg in Russia, where a blast on Monday in the old imperial metropolis of St. Petersburg killed at least 14 people and injured dozens more. A second explosive device was disarmed by the authorities in a nearby metro station. Details of the motivation and the impact of the attack are slow to come out, but what we do know so far is that the authorities have named a 22-year-old Kyrgyz-born Russian citizen, Akbarzon Jalilov, as the prime suspect in the matter. He is reported to be among the dead. There are outlets claiming that the attack was a suicide attack, but there's also reports of him detonating the device through a remote control. Authorities also believe that Mr. Jalilov was recruited by the ISIS in 2014 and the attack could possibly be a revenge for the Russian strikes on ISIS strongholds in Syria. The Interfax news agency reported today of a raid in a St. Petersburg neighborhood where another explosive device was made safe and 3 people of Central Asian origin were arrested. The authorities have claimed that there is no threat to the people in St. Petersburg. Another 8 people have been detained for questioning in connection with Monday's blast. The mood in the city, the second biggest in Russia, remained somber, with an air of defiance as people continued with their daily lives despite the disruption caused by the attack. There is, however, much symbolism in the attack. First, there is the timing. The attack happened on the very same day that Mr. Putin was scheduled to meet his Belarusian counterpart in the city. St. Petersburg also, interestingly, is Mr. Putin's hometown. Then the attack comes on the heels of biggest anti-government protests in Russia in the last 5 years. Last Sunday in March, 26th of March, thousands of people gathered in around 100 cities in Russia to protest government corruption. Lots of people were arrested as the government declared all but 17 of those gatherings legal. Prominent among them is the opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who was also arrested while leading the protests in Moscow. Then there is the Central Asian connection. Russia has been fighting Chechen separatists since the 1990s, and they've largely been held responsible for some of the worst attacks on Russian soil, most notably the killing of 129 hostages in Moscow in the theater in 2002. While recently Russia's been spared of any major terrorist activity, the attack on Monday has refreshed the memories of that bloody past. The attack has also simultaneously put a question mark on government's image of its success in fighting terror on Russian soil. So the message that this attack is trying to convey is that if they can attack the president's hometown on the day of his visit, he is no longer invincible. This, in turn, also conveys the message that Putin regime is not invulnerable. And I think this is perhaps the symbolism that this attack is trying to bring about. Where do we go from here? That's kind of difficult to say. It appears that the Russian regime might resort to a particular harsh response to this attack, both at home and abroad. There is already the crackdown on opposition. Probably that's going to get intense, as we expect also that Russia's activities in Syria might see a spike. The world anxiously awaits Mr. Putin's word on this.
All right, thank you, Navas. So we're going to move over to the United States and Pepsi. And so Pepsi, otherwise known as I'm sorry but we don't have Coke, posted an advertisement in YouTube depicting a nondescript, peaceful protest in order to sell its product. In the ad, protesters of all colors, shapes, and sizes are in a cheerful mood, laughing, dancing, singing, and generally having a good time. Already, that might be enough to raise eyebrows and outrage, since the ad clearly downplays the role that popular protest has in raising political consciousness and affecting social change, as well as the harsh, disproportionate police brutality that serves to repress such peaceful dissent. But again, there is special symbolism in the ad that has cause for and has caused a real outcry. For one, while as previously stated, these protests are often met with heavy police repression, and police are accordingly dressed in full militaristic riot gear, in the ad, police stood stoically, in plain uniform, and watched on. Let us not forget that, recently, protests have focused on police brutality, especially the attacks on and killings of unarmed black people by the police. Second, while the protesters are apparently enthusiastic about their cause, their message is conspicuously empty. Their signs display love and join the conversation and peace symbols galore, very vague phrases and images that, along with the music and upbeat attitude of the protests, is more reminiscent of the carefree image of hippies than of demonstrators and activists who have a clear, well-defined agendas. From Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matters to Standing Rock, protests have always said loud and clear exactly what they want, and they have only been met by scorn and police brutality. Finally, in the climactic moment of the ad, Kendall Jenner, who never heard of this person until just 2 days ago, a white 21-year-old wealthy supermodel, hands one of the police officers a can of Pepsi, which The Guardian describes as a clear nod to iconic protest images such as the serene woman at Baton Rouge following the fatal shooting of Alton Sterling by police, and the anti-Vietnam War flower power protester placing carnations in rifles. Ella Heerens, the executive director of Marsha P. Johnson Institute and formerly an organizer with Black Lives Matter movement, said the ad, quote, plays down the sacrifices people have historically taken in utilizing protests. Others in Twitter call it Pepsi fail and Pepsi Lives Matter. It really seems that Pepsi couldn't have made a bigger blunder. But let's get something straight. Pepsi has since pulled the ad and apologized, but they know exactly what they were getting into and what an effect it would have. In the time that the ad was running and pressure was building up on Pepsi, the stock of Pepsi surged, though it has since fallen. Nonetheless, the brand name is going to be etched into the mind of a generation, many of whom won't care or won't even know about this tasteless ad. This is what capital does. One question remains. How in the hell did Pepsi find so many young people, many of whom were racial and ethnic minorities, who were willing to show themselves to be absolute pieces of shit? The answer is that when it comes to capital, there are no boundaries that can't be pushed, because capital creates its own boundaries. The presence of so many young people in the ad, who are the driving force of social change, is the most telling symbolism of all. In the ad, Pepsi was merely announcing exactly what capital has already made to be true. Our voices in our bodies don't matter, except to serve capital.
Well, that was good. That was good. Moving from Pepsi to with a lot of calories and a lot of sugar, which is really good for your bodies.
Oh, yeah.
To the next thing that we're going to talk about, famine. So South Sudan, the newest country on the map of the world, is one of the first to be scientifically declared from suffering from famine. On the 20th of February, the United Nations declared part of the world's newest country to be in a state of famine. And around 100,000 people in this African country, which was formed in 2011, are now facing starvation. Another 20 million people in Nigeria, Somalia, and Yemen face what the UN calls an emergency situation, which is one step short of famine. But where people are still dying from lack of food, across South Sudan as a whole, the UN judges that some 250,000 children under the age of 5 suffer from severe acute malnutrition, meaning that if they do not receive treatment immediately, they will probably die within the next 6 weeks. The occurrence of famines has been something that mankind has experienced since the first agricultural revolution thousands of years ago, but what makes this latest famine particularly abhorrent is that it does not come primarily as a consequence of drought or adverse weather conditions, but from purely man-made construction, war. Rising from the horrors of one of Africa's longest-running conflicts, this particularly oil-rich country has been ravaged by a civil war just 2 years after it declared independence from Sudan, dashing all hopes of prosperity that its people had dreamed of. So the conflict basically started off by a coup plot that the president of the country, Salva Kiir, suspected that his vice president, Riek Machar, was plotting against him, right? So he basically called out against, he fired the vice president, and the vice president, of course, he belongs to another ethnic group. He did not take very lightly to that, right? And that led into an infighting between these two very powerful people who have, of course, their own powerful tribal and ethnic support. Since then on, the conflict has ravaged the whole country. Some 3.5 million people have been displaced because of the violence, and around 20 to 25,000 people have been reported to dead. And add to that, this 1 to 100,000 people that the UN is talking about are facing near-death conditions. Now, let me make this very clear. This calamity that has befallen the people of South Sudan is a making of actions of man, not God, as it was before. The government deserves much of the blame. It has little interest in helping get aid in, and indeed often seems determined to stop the flow. One of the first acts when UN declared the country to be facing a famine was that they jacked up the visa fees from $100 to $10,000. Now try to imagine this, right? Most of the people coming in this country right now are aid workers. They're the ones that are going to be affected with this visa fees increase. But the government is arguing that we're going to raise revenue through this and probably, save our population from starvation. Well, I don't know. The government, the UN has also, besides this, documented 967 instances of denials of humanitarian aid that affected children from the outbreak, and this have happened in the course of the 3 years between 2013 and 2016. The pretext that the government has used is that most probably these aid convoys are going to be attacked by their enemies, by the opposition, and they're going to then sell this food in the black market and use the money to buy weapons and arm themselves. Right? Stupid. A similar story can be experienced in Yemen, where Saudi Arabia is fighting the Houthi rebels. According to FEWS Net, 2 million people are there in an emergency situation. That is 1 grade below famine. Another 5 to 8 million people do not have enough to eat. And the problem over here is that Saudi Arabia has done a maritime blockade of Yemen. Yemen is a country that depends on 90% of its food supplies to come through its ports, right? But now that its largest port, Hodeidah, has been bombed, it's non-operational, plus the coalition that Saudi Arabia is using against the Houthi rebels in Yemen has led to a maritime blockade. So any aid convoys or ships that are coming through are not being allowed to go. There is a warehouse in the humanitarian city, which is a storage center used by aid agencies in Dubai, which already has new mobile cranes that could help uplift these stocks of rations of food aid to the port in Hodeidah. But when the UN tried to install them, Saudi Arabia did not allow that. They were suspecting again that the Houthi rebels are going to use these cranes to earn port fees, and probably these cranes are going to be used to ship off weapons. Now, this is despite the assurances that UN has been giving to the Saudi authorities that all the ships docking in Hodeidah are inspected by UN, and arms anyway being supplied to Yemen are entering on small boats or through overland routes. Besides this utterly disgusting aspect that this famine has to it, it is also newsworthy for being one of the first famines that has been declared using the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification. This IPC scale is a recent addition to disaster management science that classifies a situation as famine only when 20% of households suffer extreme food shortages, 30% of the population suffers extreme malnutrition, and at least one of each 5,000 inhabitants are dying per day. So very quantified, very scientific way of gauging what famine is. Unlike 10 years ago, when just a rookie journalist or some aid worker could claim that these parts of the world are facing famine. So with this general logic of measure and control that plagued the modern world, this method of declaring famines means that we're going to use a lot of data. Yoo-hoo! And this data must be gathered extensively. In countries affected by severe food insecurity, UN agencies such as the World Food Programme and UNICEF conduct smart surveys, going house to house, weighing children, and asking about food intake and deaths in the family, thus bringing another aspect of our political lives in the hands of experts. But as the case of Nigeria demonstrates, this might not always be so beneficial. In Nigeria, a famine may have already happened late last year, nobody's sure, because it was too difficult to gather the data to use for this classification to officially declare a famine. Over the past 2 years, as the Nigerian army has clawed back towns in the northeast of the country from Boko Haram, starving people have poured in from nearby villages. The population of Maiduguri, the capital of the Borno state, has doubled from almost 800,000 hungry displaced people who've moved there into makeshift shelters. Perhaps as many remain in areas that aid workers cannot reach. Part of the reason is that Nigerian army does not allow them in. Most aid agencies are reluctant to deliver food in areas held by murderous jihadists anyway. You don't really have someone to negotiate access with. Is a quote from Peter Lundberg, the UN's Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator in Nigeria. Yeah, but even then, in the areas that the army has secured, malnutrition has fallen sharply. So that is another country that is facing starvation and death by starvation if nothing happens quickly. With that bit, I think we can talk about the GPS.
Yeah, we can jump into discussion. You know, and I had a question actually because I think the theme of our 4 contributions today was actually war, although that wasn't like the thing that we talked about. But I mean, it's something that is always present, and I think it's to be understood that war, when you have a war, whatever problems that a country has, a war intensifies them, right? A war creates starvation, or the threat of violence already puts sort of a blanket of oppression over a country so that they cannot be free, right? And this goes back into the thing about Syria. Syria's been going to war for 6 years, and what are we gonna do, right?
And if you look back at it, this started off as one of those things that everybody was willing to support, right? The Arab Spring, it was all good until as long as the people were wanted democracy, but then boom, it turns into a civil war, and now the country's a mess. It's perhaps never going to be what it was before.
Yeah, it's definitely not going to be what it was before.
Yeah, and also I want to make a point about that. That bit you spoke about Pepsi and protests. I think I was some time ago I was reading this thing about all these big companies cashing out on this sort of activism that a lot of young people have. For instance, there's all these pictures that of Starbucks drinking protesters. I don't know, demanding racial equality.
I mean, it's disgusting, right? It's just absolutely disgusting, and anyone in their right mind should boycott these companies for doing that. But
totally. But this also tells you that how the logic of the market works to expropriate. Anything that they see happening around. They just bang go in there. So they see there's a bunch of protests, and there's this air of radicalism in that sense, and they go like, boom, we're going to be on the right side of these people. So Starbucks comes out and says, oh, we're going to hire 15,000 or 150,000 refugees now, and boom, they get brownie points, and everybody's drinking chai latte for being an activist.
That's great. I mean, Starbucks has been doing that the whole time. When this environmental movement was really getting underway, Starbucks was saying, okay, you buy a coffee and you can offset this amount of blah 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 global warming. You can also support these wonderful poor farmers in South America with fair trade and stuff like that. And okay, it's fun to quote Zizek, but Zizek is often right about this. What we're doing is basically is we want to have that chocolate laxative, right? Because chocolate causes constipation, And but we don't want to give up chocolate. So what do? We make chocolate and laxative and we eat it, and that's what we're doing with Starbucks as well.
Yeah. But still, I think I find it really interesting that how capital has this unbridled power to appropriate any sort of message that it can just sell.
It doesn't stop. It can't.
Yeah, as long as it can be sold. Yeah.
Yeah. They've already. I said this. They set the boundaries for everything, right? I mean, they make the purview within which we can see things, and then as soon as anyone sort of looks outside of this little bubble or this box, they expropriate
They
right?
bring that in.
They bring that in.
That is true.
I mean, it's the never-ending transformation up that capital does in order to protect itself. Because without being able to change like this, it wouldn't protect itself.
That is true.
One question is, excuse me. One question is, if capital does go in this direction and start, expropriating these leftist images, is that sustainable for capital? Because that people become critical of that, as we've seen.
Yeah, but critique. As long as critique has helped capital. See, from where I see it, as long as there is an issue-based critique of capital, that is something that capital has welcomed. With the rise of the welfare state and everything, that was a single issue-based agenda, right? Capital expropriates it. With all these environmental concerns, it's single issue-based agenda. Capital appropriated. So now you have a big industry that is just green, eco-friendly, and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And now you have this sort of political activism,
Yeah.
right? That a lot of social media has empowered everybody to have an opinion,
Yeah.
and express that opinion,
Yeah.
in ways which people might not have thought, say, 10 years ago.
I'm honestly waiting for the time when you join like a political group or something like that, and you start becoming an activist. And this group was formed by Pepsi, whatever, right? Or Coca-Cola, it's like a group that's against, let's say, rainforest destruction or something like that. And Coca-Cola is the one representing it,
Yeah, a lot of these, fair trade, for example, what works with a lot of these big companies. I have a very good example from here in Hamburg. The football team St. Pauli, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is very outrightly anti-capitalistic, right?
Yeah.
But it also has to, do its fair share of bidding, of getting money to maintain stuff, right?
Yeah.
So they've gone out and sold their stuff and sold the marketing rights, advertising rights to their fan memorabilia and all that kind of stuff.
Well,
so there is one thing that's for sure, is that you just cannot survive without capital. There's one way or the other.
Yeah, and this is also a criticism on I think this will get into Chell's topic too. Like lots of the anarcho-capitalists, for instance, they say like, oh well, if you're fed up with capitalism, why do you buy this laptop or this phone or something like that, or why do you go to work or stuff like that, right? And that what you just said is that you cannot actually survive without doing these things unless you really just go out into the woods and like work your ass off with a group of people and start like a little hippie commune where you're growing your own food. But even then, you're cutting yourself off from modern medicine. You're cutting yourself off from electricity and all these things.
Yeah, for most people, that's not even a viable alternative anyway.
That's not a viable alternative except for like really rich, spoiled people.
Yeah, exactly,
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
But I think we need to, my opinion, for example, I've thought about this a lot of times. I've heard people say this sort of stuff, and I've said this to a lot of people too. This sort of an argument, you should not be using an iPhone, for example. If Eddie was here, I've done probably this joke with him too, that why do you have an iPhone? And he was like,
I don't know why people have iPhones in the first place, but it's not.
Yeah, but still, what I'm trying to say, I think that's not really going after capital by saying that I don't want an iPhone.
Yeah, that's right. That's not.
What's going after capital is saying that I'm not going to change my iPhone every 6 months when they're coming out with a new one.
Yeah.
That is the sort of the culture that capital wants us to imbibe.
Yeah. Then they want you to keep
that
on.
You go
every
every Saturday you go and you buy new clothes, and every season you have a new phone, and I don't know.
That's why they make iPhones so destructible. They can destroy them. So easily, and you can't replace the parts. Or clothes, clothes just they get old so quickly. Look, I've got holes in my pants, guys.
Yeah. And if you want to go against capital, you don't do that by drinking the Kool-Aid and saying, well, I'm going to shop at Starbucks because it's good for the world.
Yeah,
You know,
I mean that's also
Starbucks,
that's even
you know,
worse.
yeah,
You
totally.
have to
I
be
mean, you know,
completely.
yeah. If you're going to be anti-capitalist, you have to sort of, you can still, drink Starbucks coffee because maybe there's no other coffee available, and we all need our coffee. I mean, maybe coffee, it's not exactly, the most relevant, like necessity to life, or whatever. But nevertheless, we drink our coffee, but don't drink it because you fooled yourself into believing that that Starbucks is better capitalism. It's still capitalism, and its goal is still maximizing profit, and it will do what it needs to do to get that done. That's why it tells us that this is good for you, because it wants to sell it to you. It doesn't actually want to help the world. It wants to sell more coffee.
That's the point. I mean, when they're doing these things, they want to sell you something, and that's already a point of being suspect.
And I think which is why they need to expropriate all these new images, this new symbolism, to be able to sell their stuff. And I was reading yesterday, for example, that Starbucks and McDonald's, they paid 3 cents more than the minimum wage to the people working at their joints. What does that tell you about them?
Tells you quite a lot, I would say.
Yeah.
All right, so I would say that is good for the first part of our podcast. When we get back, we will have Chell talking about refuting Dave Rubin and debunking the so-called regressive left.
That's right. That's correct. That's what
with our current issue analysis, CIA. I'm so creative.